It was another day at Dally Cars. The newly appointed manager, Mr. Brown Simon, entered the fully stocked showroom. Simon walked around assessing and reassessing the condition of the cars before opening up for business. The fleet of luxurious cars stood gleaming in the sun, reflecting the image of anyone standing near it. Yet Simon barked more orders at the people who worked under him. Wipe everything clean. I want to see myself through the windows. His employees jolted to work. The showroom became a bustle. However, amid things, the showroom doors opened, and a man impeccably dressed in a shiny black suit walked in. He had an air of confidence about him. His steps were sturdy, stoic, and loud, overpowering Simon's orders. The employees stopped and stared for a moment. Dally Cars had seen its fair share of wealthy people, but this man stood in the top tier, pronouncing authority before saying his first words. Simon narrowed his eyes, taking in the features of the approaching man. His eyes suddenly stopped when he noticed the sticker on the man's briefcase. A Republican, he thought to himself. Who's in charge here? The stranger asked. Simon perked up, his stance rather aggressive as he approached the buyer. Hello, the stranger greeted, extending a handshake to Simon. Simon hesitated, looking up and down at the buyer like his presence irritated him. The stranger ignored Simon's cold gesture, shoving his hands into his pocket. I would like a comfortable car for a family of 6. Simon shoved his hands into his pocket too, squaring up his shoulders. A family car? Or a getaway vehicle? Excuse me? Duncan frowned. You Republicans love a good hunt, don't you? More like a roadkill. The stranger was taken aback by Simon's comment, but still, he remained composed. If anything, being a Republican senator for the last 5 years had taught him that people weren't always welcoming, no matter how distinct and polite you appeared to be. I beg to differ, he interjected. I do not appreciate your tone. Simon let out a dry chuckle. Even though Simon was laughing, the buyer could feel Simon's hate for him oozing through the laughter. Not only was it obvious to him, but even to the employees who had all stopped working, who were now completely invested in the tensed exchange between the wealthy man and their manager. Look here, Mr. Senator, the buyer cut in. Senator Hooliver, Simon scoffed with disdain. Look here, Senator. Out there, you give orders, but in here, you take them or walk out the door. The senator was so shocked by the unexpected turn of events. He had never been in the news for doing anything evil. He hadn't ever permitted a protest throughout his career. He always tried to resolve every issue peacefully. The senator wondered if he had made an offensive statement in the last week that would warrant this treatment. He glanced at the boys, and their expressions quickly changed from the admiration he had noticed a few minutes ago to something sinister, something accusatory. Duncan sighed softly, turning back to the manager. What's your name? I don't see how that's relevant, Senator. Duncan frowned. His disappointment showed in his expression. Is there someone else I can talk to? Someone higher? I just want to buy a car for my family, he said. Simon let out another chuckle, this time more hysterical than the last. Jack, he called out. Come over here. Duncan exhaled softly, waiting patiently for the person to come out. He heard footsteps approaching, but when he turned around, the person he met wasn't what he expected. Dressed in jeans stained with engine black oils and dust, a shirtless man, as tall as a giant, with a big and intimidating build, appeared. He had the piercing gaze of a hawk focused on Duncan as he approached. Duncan stepped aside, wondering what was happening. Sir, Jack said politely. Nodding his head in Duncan's direction, Simon spoke with mockery. He wants to talk to someone higher. I figured he must be talking about you. Duncan put his gaze down, shaking his head unbelievably. I'm gonna ask you to leave. Duncan raised his gaze, looking up at the tall man in front of him. Why, if I may ask? Because we reserve the right to refuse anyone. That is accurate, but what is the reason for exercising this right? Duncan persisted. Simon sized him up and down. His eyes landed on the sticker on Duncan's briefcase again, and Simon grew even colder. You just don't fit our customer expectations. You lack a certain quality. Duncan raised an eyebrow. His patience was slipping. A quality? What quality would that be? Jack, the shirtless giant, shoved his hands in his pockets and brought out a spanner. Sir, I suggest you leave right now before this gets unpleasant. Simon raised a hand, pausing Jack for a moment. The quality you lack is sincerity. Aren't you too sparkly for a Republican senator? You go around causing chaos in the government, demanding lower taxes and smaller government. Yet you show up here dressed all sparkly, looking for a luxurious car? Isn't that pretentious, Senator? Duncan took a step back and released a deep breath. He wasn't even upset about this behavior. He was just concerned and disappointed. He had dealt with resistance, political opposition, reporters twisting his words, even members of his party doubting his intentions and calling him self-righteous. He had seen it all. However, this was new to him, being treated like an outcast because he dressed and looked rich. It was completely new to him, new and unacceptable. He turned to the employees, scanning their faces. They looked uncomfortable, unable to look him in the eye. Duncan walked to the employees, his gaze hardening. Tell me, boys, is this how you run a business here, or is it just me? None of you say a word, do you understand? Simon barked. If you have a problem, talk it out with me, Senator. The way he spat the word senator made Duncan understand. This wasn't even about him. It was personal. It was a personal decision to behave this way toward him. Duncan tightened his grip on his briefcase, pressing his lips together. All right then, he said, turning around. As he walked away, he could hear the employees whispering to each other. Duncan pulled the door open, but before stepping out, he stopped. Mr. Simon, you owe me an apology. Simon scoffed. Ridiculous. I'll apologize to you if you apologize to the people you've misled, harmed, and murdered to reach your pretentious career. As soon as that comment left Simon's lips, his employees held their breaths. An uneasy silence settled over Dally Cars. Duncan clenched his hands into a fist. Before his composure would completely collapse, he turned around and left. As soon as the door closed, Simon released a laugh of triumph, basking in his victory. However, he had missed an important factor. He hadn't just insulted a senator of the United States of America. He had insulted the man who owned every car in this room, his boss, the president of Dally Cars. Unfortunately, he didn't know. The next morning, Simon had just arrived at the parking lot of the automobile company. At first glance, he noticed a handful of people hovering around the company. He didn't think much of it since Dally Cars was well known. However, he was unaware that Dally Cars was no longer just a dealership. It had become a spectacle. When Simon stepped down from his car, he noticed more than a handful of angry and unpleased people. They all had accusations in their eyes. He walked into the showroom, only to find his employees clamored together in silence, each one with lines of worry on their faces. "What's going on?" Simon barked as usual. No one said a word. They couldn't. Simon looked around suspiciously. Then he saw it. A large banner plastered at the left side of the showroom. Its words were clear and concise. "The Republicans are not pretentious." Simon was shocked. However, he quickly hid his emotions. "Who did this?" he yelled. His employees didn't need to reply to him. Through the wide glass windows, a crowd trooped in. They held signs outright condemning Simon's accusations. Just like that, a protest began right in front of Dally Cars. Soon, the street was filled with reporters. Then, a few onlookers gathered. The Republican protesters held up their banners matching around Dally Cars in a peaceful protest of Simon's accusations. Simon frowned. Then, suddenly, he broke into a round of laughter. "That damn senator, he did this. He paid all these people to come here." His employees perked their heads up. There was a division even amongst them. Some felt defeated and wanted to stop him from saying more derogatory things. One of them hesitated, but ultimately stepped forward to explain the situation. "I don't think he had a hand in this, sir," he said cautiously. "The footage of what happened yesterday went viral." "What footage?" "The security cameras," the salesman explained. "Someone leaked it. It's everywhere now." Just then, Simon's phone buzzed in his pocket. When he pulled it out, he was hit by dozens of notifications from social media posts, news articles, opinion pieces. Republican Senator Hoover was humiliated at the luxury dealership and refused service. Dally Cars manager accuses Republicans of being pretentious, says Senator used people for his career. Simon scrolled through his phone. An endless stream of articles popped up one after the other. Simon swallowed hard, disappointed that all the articles seemed to be against him, until he read a comment. Finally! The comment said, "Someone stands up to those wealthy hypocrites." The next one said, "I'm buying my next car from Dally Cars. I love their principles." Simon smiled. His confidence returned. He turned around and met his employees. "All right, boys, let's get ready for the day." He sounded rather cheerful. The employees exchanged uneasy glances. The dealership was in such turmoil, and Simon was smiling. They had been open for hours, yet not one customer had come. Instead, camera lights flashed at their door, and more banners danced in the air. "Boss, is this okay, Jack?" the hefty man said, expressing his concern. "We haven't had a single customer since morning." "Yes," some of the salesmen concurred. "Maybe you should." "I should what?" Simon snapped. "Apologize?" The boys exchanged glances, and some stepped back, cautious not to offend the glaring man. "Address them." Jeremy, the youngest in the group, said, "Maybe you should address them." Simon's jaw tightened as he faced the young man. "Address them?" he asked, his voice filled with agitation. "Address them? All right, address them. I will." With that, Simon entered his office and came out with a manual microphone. He stormed out of the showroom, slamming the door as he stepped outside. He was now standing face to face with the peaceful protesters. "My nephew was attacked at a political protest last year," he began. "A protest organized by people like you. A poor 14-year-old was almost matched till he became lifeless. No one cared. None of you checked on him." Cameras went flying, and reporters clamored around Simon. He said he would address them, and that's exactly what he was doing. "You Republicans care more about how much money the government is taking from you. You demand conservative laws and a strong defense system. Yet when that boy fell in front of you, no one stopped. You asked the government for things that you're not even willing to give to each other. Tell me, isn't that pretentious?" The air stilled. Some of the protesters looked away. "You can go back to whoever paid you to do this and tell him that I said he failed. I will never do business with him." With that, Simon turned around and went inside. He had left the protest ground, but his words lingered. The protesters' voices became low, and some signs were dropped. Simon returned to his employees. "None of you mention this nonsense to me again. Do you hear me? Over the next few days, the scandal only grew bigger. Simon's subtle hint that Senator Hoover had paid people to protest in front of his office exploded in ways he could not imagine. The internet went wild. While people debated whether this was the new approach to gaining relevance and recognition, Senator Hoover's phone buzzed with requests for radio talk shows and night television interviews. He was quite disturbed by the level of attention he was getting. Simon's comments and defaming comments got to him too. Most importantly, he was curious about the person who had leaked the security footage to the public. Simon went to the office daily, dealing with glaring eyes and accusatory expressions. The street was a mess. Protesters had doubled, and now his supporters had gathered too. Despite the number of people who supported and stood for him online and on site, Dally Cars recorded the worst week of sales. After 3 days of zero sales, the employees became even more worried. "Sir," Jeremy went to Simon, "we think you should apologize. You know our livelihood depends on our sales." "Get out!" Simon snapped. His voice rose to the brim. Jeremy jumped, startled. "Get out and go home. You are fired." Jeremy stood up and returned to the showroom, where his colleagues were waiting. Just then, the glass doors swung open. A man in a tailored suit stepped inside. He didn't look like a customer. He had a different air around him. He looked professional and completely untouched by the chaos outside. "I'm looking for Mr. Brown Simon." "Who's asking?" Simon's voice cut through the thick, tense air. The man strode toward him, unfazed by the piercing look in his eyes. As soon as he dropped his briefcase on the table, Simon cited the same sticker as Senator Hoover's on his bag. He scoffed. "Another Republican." "Great, yes, that's right," the man replied, his tone calm. "I'm here on behalf of Senator Hoover." Simon scoffed. "He comes up with new ideas every day." The man remained unbothered, handing him a neatly folded letter. Simon squeezed his brows as soon as he read the content of the letter. "What's this? A lawsuit?" "It's an ultimatum," the lawyer replied. Simon bursted into a crack of laughter. "An ultimatum? For what?" The lawyer clasped his hands in front of him. "You have two choices. Apologize publicly to Senator Hoover or leave Dally Cars." At that point, Simon could not contain his sarcasm. "And who exactly is telling me to leave? The senator doesn't own this place. He has no power here." The lawyer narrowed his eyes as he looked at Simon. Then he took a step closer, and almost in a whisper he said, "He does." Simon frowned. He took a step back and reconnected his eyes with Simon. "Duncan Hoover isn't just a Republican senator. He's the owner of Dally Cars," the lawyer said. A heavy silence settled over the room. Simon's smirk faded. The employees exchanged stunned glances. Jeremy's shocked face slowly yet gradually widened into a smile. "So technically, Simon, you work for a Republican." Simon clenched his teeth so hard he could feel the metallic taste of blood gathering in his tongue. For the first time since the confrontation, he felt something stronger than the sense of victory. He felt dread. The scandal had lasted for days, and finally, Hoover decided to address it. Many people had approached him, reporters, talk show hosts, television hosts, and even a panel was set to discuss the scandal, but he had always refused to make a statement. However, it was finally time to, and he stood behind the podium, the bright camera lights flashing on him, and the room filled with reporters. Their microphones were stretched at him, and everyone wanted to hear his takes. Everyone wanted to know what the senator had to say, how this situation had affected him this whole time, the reason for his silence, and what he aimed to do. Hoover took a deep breath and adjusted the microphone. The scandal had gone on long enough. It was time to end it. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady but tired. "I want to address the unfortunate incident involving Mr. Simon and I. First and foremost, I want to sincerely apologize to Mr. Dally, Mr. Simon's nephew. What happened was unacceptable, and I take full responsibility for those actions. That was a Republican protest, and that shouldn't have happened to you." Shortly after the senator said those words, a murmur spread through the crowd. The press scribbled in their notes, whispering as if they had caught the highlight of the report today. "But beyond that, I want to apologize not just as a senator, but as a man," Senator Hoover continued. "I regret any harm caused, and I sincerely hope we can move forward." He paused, letting his words settle, and then looked at the cameras. "I ask the public for their understanding. This has become a spectacle, but at the heart of it, this is about accountability. Mistakes were made, and I hope we can all move past this with dignity." With a small nod, he stepped away from the podium, ignoring the multiple questions. He had said what he needed to say, but there was still one more thing to do. Later that afternoon, Senator Hoover arrived at Dally's Cars again, but his intention was not to purchase a car this time. It was something else. The large glass windows reflected the sun, making the place look almost too polished, like Simon himself. The moment Hoover stepped inside, Simon spotted him. He leaned against the counter, a smirk already forming on his lips. He had been expecting this. "Well, well," Simon said, crossing his arms. "The great Senator Hoover, gracing my humble dealership with his presence. To what do I owe this honor?" Hoover heaved a tired sigh. He didn't have the patience for games. He walked up to Simon, his expression calm but firm. "I came for an apology," he said. Simon raised an eyebrow, not sure what to make of this. Was this a show? He scanned around, looking for cameras. Maybe the senator had come to cause another spectacle. This time, he needed his own media. "An apology? For what exactly?" You know very well, Hulliver replied. You were wrong, and I acknowledge that. I made a public apology. Now it's your turn to do the right thing, Hulliver said firmly. Simon stood frozen for a while, amused by Hulliver's statement, and then he let out a short laugh. You think just because you made some speech I should roll over and do the same? I don't owe you anything, Senator, he said with a sharp and bold gaze. Hulliver's jaw tightened. He no longer held back. You leaked the security footage to the press. Simon's eyes widened in shock over the statement, but his smirk returned. And? Why? Hulliver asked, studying him. What was your goal? Simon shrugged. To show the world the people you associate with, to expose the hypocrisy. Hulliver nodded slowly. Hypocrisy, he repeated. That's an interesting word coming from you. Simon's expression faded slightly, a little confused and intrigued at the same time. Meaning? You say I'm a hypocrite, Hulliver continued, but here you are, refusing to apologize after creating a public scandal. You leaked that footage for your gain, not for justice or accountability. You wanted attention. You wanted to humiliate me. Simon's smirk faltered. That's not. Let's be honest, Simon, Hulliver cut in, his voice steady and firm. If this were really about justice, you would have spoken to me directly before running to the press. But you didn't, because you weren't looking for an apology. You were looking for compensation. Simon stiffened. That's not true, isn't it? Hulliver asked, tilting his head. This whole thing could have been handled quietly, but you dragged it out. You played the victim while making sure my name stayed in the headlines. So tell me, Simon, who's the bigger hypocrite here? Silence hung between them, leaving Simon to reflect on the senator's words. He knew even if it may not have started as a scheme for compensation, he had allowed it to get there. He looked away, his fingers tapping against the counter. He had enjoyed watching the senator squirm, but now the tables had turned. Hulliver sighed. I'll give you the same option I gave you before. Apologize and we move on, or don't, and this keeps going. Simon's jaw clenched. He hated losing, hated being backed into a corner. However, Hulliver was right. Dragging this out any longer would only make him look worse. With great reluctance, he exhaled and muttered, I apologize. Hulliver nodded. Now say it like you mean it. Simon shot him a glare, but straightened up. I apologize, he repeated, this time clearly, for how I handled things. Hulliver studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Good. Without another word, he turned and walked out, leaving Simon with his pride bruised, but the fight was finally over. That day, as Hulliver walked out of Daly's cars, he never looked back. He had gotten everything, and more than enough out of this scandal, and was now ready to move on. However, Simon stood in silence, forced to swallow his pride, the very thing that had fueled his arrogance. Hulliver's message sounded clear to him at that point. Sometimes winning isn't about proving a point, it's about knowing when to close the chapter. What do you think? Did Hulliver's approach change something in Simon? Was Simon's bitterness toward Duncan justified? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. If this video was inspiring, like, share, and subscribe to this channel. Before you go, watch the next video on your screen.